Good evening. Tonight on Santana True Crime, we will be discussing John Eric Armstrong. I'm grateful to have B.R. Bates with us. B.R. Bates is the authority on Armstrong and is the author of the book, The Baby Doll Serial Killer, The John Eric Armstrong Homicides. She wrote it with Gerald Cliff, who served with the Detroit Police Department for 31 years, retiring at commander. He was also a leader on the Violent Crimes Task Force, which we will discuss later on. When I looked at this case, I sincerely tried to find as many sources as I could, and it's almost laughable how B.R. Bates is pretty much the source, or they're just saying what you've said. So I thought that was really interesting. I did find, did you start this book earlier without him? Because I found missing from Michigan Ave.
Yes, yes. Missing from Michigan Ave was the prior edition of this book. It was an academic edition that was released by an academic publisher. Yeah, but basically same content, a little bit different format, different cover, different title.
Okay, well, you still own everything that is relatively credible in that space. So I appreciate that, and I sincerely thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I wanted to start with Armstrong. He's born in North Carolina, which is where I'm from, and I thought that
Mm,
was interesting. He's from New
okay.
Bern, actually, which
Yep.
is towards the coast, and he's born on November 23rd, 1973, and he's got a younger brother that dies in 1978.
hmm
And so, can you tell me about that and how impactful that was on him?
That was a big event for his upbringing. That was maybe even the event of the significant event of his childhood. He really loved his baby brother. He spent a lot of time with his baby brother. And when the baby died in the crib, he was very, very traumatized by that. His mother said that he was so distraught that not long after that, little Eric, well, he didn't even go by Eric at that point. His name is John Eric, but later, a little bit later in his childhood, he started going by just Eric. But when he was only 5 years old or so and the baby died, not long after that, his mom said, when she spoke to the media years later, she said that he rode his bicycle into traffic, almost as if he was going to join his baby brother. So that was really sad.
And so growing up, when we're looking at kind of his teenage years, I saw where he also had an incident at school where he locked himself into the bathroom. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it evidently was about a girlfriend. Um, the stories vary a little bit, but evidently from what he said, his girlfriend at school was pressuring him to have a sexual relationship, and he was uncomfortable with that. And this was one of the times where I think this led to a sort of a almost suicidal um, ideation for him, which I have found that seems to happen with some serial killers that they attempt or consider suicide. And so, yeah, that was a pretty meaningful event in his childhood as well.
And I've heard different reports on this, and I know what your feeling is, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you. I've heard that John's father abandoned him as a child. Can you tell us if that actually happened or not?
He did leave the family. It is true that his biological father, whose name was also John Ezra Armstrong, who has since passed on, he did leave the family. As far as why he chose to leave, I think that there's some stuff there that really cannot be substantiated. But there was always a great deal of resentment that Eric had for his biological father for leaving the family. And so he focused a lot of his resentment on his biological father.
And so I also saw in high school, one of the other events that was impactful was the event where he lost his girlfriend due to a gift being given to her by another guy. Is
Yeah,
that
that's
is
the
there any
story.
truth to that, or is that
That
just
is
a
the story.
story floating around?
That is a story that I believe only appeared after Armstrong's arrest. And he had a couple survivors, I think actually 3 of his 5 survivors in Detroit, because he killed 5 people in Detroit, and then he attacked 5 people who survived. I think it was 3, at least 2, but I think 3 of those survivors said that as he was attempting to strangle them, as he was choking them, he yelled, "I hate prostitutes, I hate prostitutes, I hate effing prostitutes." And so there was this hatred. And police, I think, when they were questioning him after his arrest, they were trying to get at, where is this hatred of prostitutes, of sex workers coming from? And I really feel it's something he threw out there as like a rationale or an explanation. Well, when I was in school, I had this girlfriend and she left me for somebody else who bought her gifts, and I felt like she was prostituting herself. I mean, it's a little
Yeah.
piece of an explanation at best. But yeah, that's my own feeling on it. I'll leave it to the reader or the listener to decide that.
Yeah, there's a lot of things floating around. I know some of it came from him. Another thing that he floated around, from what I heard, was that he killed someone in Newbern at 17 years old,
He claims that.
but
Well, okay.
Newbern cannot find a body or missing person, correct?
Yeah, correct. He said that, and he almost said it, I think, almost in passing when he was being questioned by police, and it never really went anywhere. It was just a brief mention. Police really didn't do anything with it, although they did. I think when NCIS stepped into the case because of these confessions he made at the time of his arrest to all these other alleged murders when he served in the Navy in the 1990s. NCIS stepped in to investigate those murders, alleged murders, or those confessions to ports all over the world. And I think at that time, NCIS did devote a little bit of time to the Newbern angle, like thinking, okay, before he went into the Navy, which was 1992, is it possible he killed somebody? And he was young, he was only 18, he had just graduated from high school. Is it possible that he killed somebody there? Or he even would lead you to believe it might have even been a little earlier than that. I did a little poking around to see if I could find some unsolved crimes in that area, or really in the greater area in North Carolina, and really couldn't pin it on anything. I do remember there was like a store clerk at a convenience store that went missing and was never found. So there's cases like that that are possibilities, I suppose, but there was nothing concrete to place on that very brief admission on his part.
That's really interesting. I didn't know if you were looking at strangulation deaths or if you're just looking at missing persons. I mean, it's quite a large net. And North Carolina also has, of course, other people that kill people by strangulation as well. So it's kind of hard,
Mhm.
right?
Right. Anytime I watch, I watch a lot of true crime. And anytime I watch a true crime TV episode about a serial killer who operated in the 1990s, I pay attention to the possible murders that might be attributed to them, and if they perhaps happen in any of those places where Armstrong Armstrong was known to have been with the Navy, or even growing up in Newbern, because I do wonder if maybe there are some unsolved cases that just have not been discovered yet that could have possibly be attributed to him.
And that's a really interesting point, and I completely agree. And my thought is, with most serial killers, we do not know their body count. I know that recently they're looking at BTK for some murders in Oklahoma, and I'm not sure if you're aware of his word search that he put out, which some people are now claiming that they found clues in there that
Ah,
spell out. Yeah, I'm trying
wow.
to actually validate this because I had someone that reached out to me saying that she solved word search, and it
Oh,
look
okay.
yeah, it's really interesting stuff. I'm just not
Yeah.
ready to put her on the show yet until I can actually validate that
Oh,
this
sure,
is somewhat
yeah.
reliable and not just,
That is interesting.
a
I
bunch of
don't think I'd
gibberish.
heard about the word search, but I did just read Catherine Ramsland's book, which is very, very personal for BTK, how much he wrote to her, how much he shared with her. And that book right after I had read Carrie Rader's account of her life with her dad in a completely different perspective, and just reconciling those two perspectives, one of a psychiatrist or psychologist and one of the daughter, was
Right.
really, really fascinating.
That is fascinating. So, what I think is also fascinating about Armstrong is he joins the Navy, which is really an ideal place to be if you want to kill prostitutes because you're going around the world, you're
Yep.
in ports for a very short time. In the
Mhm.
ports that he's going to, like Thailand, Singapore was
Singapore.
on the list.
Yep.
I know he went to Spokane and a few Hawaii was on the
Mhm.
list.
Mhm.
But a lot of these, I mean, he can get in and out, and I really don't think those countries probably care about prostitutes being killed as well. Is that
Absolutely,
what you
all
heard?
of that. Yep, and you figure, okay, in those ports, they know these Navy guys are coming in, and Navy women too, but especially the cliche. It is a cliche of the sailor coming into the port, a strange port that he's not usually at. This is a prostitution culture that caters to this clientele. And definitely, if a sex worker comes up missing, it is not necessarily investigated in some of these foreign locales. So, a very unfortunate aspect of that and of his confessions to these killings that may or may not have happened because they just could not be corroborated.
What did you find out about his time in the Navy? Was I've heard a few things, but what have you heard?
I talked to a few people who served on the ship with him. He was aboard the USS Nimitz, which is a pretty well-known well-known ship, and was in service a long, long time. Um, and the people that I talked to who were on the ship with him described him, one person in particular described him as big but soft. So he was a big guy. He's a guy that on first glance you might not want to pick a fight with, but there was a naive quality to him, a soft quality to him, and they nicknamed him Opie after the character in classic television that I know is Richie Cunningham, but Ron Howard. So because he had red hair and he had glasses and whatever, but it was more his demeanor, his personality that was the reason that they nicknamed him Opie. And so he struck people that way. I think he kept to himself quite a bit, but he seemed to get along with people. He really didn't have any conflicts. When you look through, like again, NCIS stepping in to investigate the case, they took a really close look at Armstrong's Navy records and tried to find any little blips on the scale, like, okay, what can we learn about the 1992 to 1998 or 99, 98, I guess it was, that he was in the Navy. What can we learn about those years? And there really was nothing noteworthy on that. He had complained about some conflicts at home that he had with people he went to school with, but pretty mild, nothing violent or murderous. And he complained about migraine headaches. Well, a lot of people have migraine headaches. So he was not disciplined so much. He did a job. He did a couple different jobs. One of the jobs was to work in the barber shop aboard the Nimitz, but really there was nothing that stood out in that time that he was on the ship.
That is interesting how you almost have these different personalities of being the soft-spoken. I mean, he was a 300-pound man, so I don't know if he was 300 in the Navy, but I've heard he was 300 pounds.
He was in Detroit. He was about that. He was upper, like, between 250 and 300. So, yeah, he probably was thinner
He's
in
a
the
big
Navy,
guy.
I would
Yeah.
assume.
So when he leaves the Navy, he settles into Dearborn Heights, Michigan.
Mhm.
What type of area is Dearborn Heights?
Dearborn Heights is on the west side of Metro Detroit, and where he lived was very much a neighborhood, and it was perfectly fine, perfectly comfortable, middle class neighborhood, nothing shabby about it whatsoever. He lived in, I guess, what would be considered a bungalow house. I think it was no, it was 2 stories, but just a very, very normal seeming average home on an average street, a tree lined street, as the cliche goes. You could go out walking there, I'm sure, and there would be no problem, not any crime to speak of. So, very much fitting with his boy next door image that people were struck by when they met Armstrong and met.
And about how far is Dearborn from Detroit, from like Michigan Ave, where he's picking up prostitutes?
On where he lived in Dearborn Heights, he would not have taken the highway. He would have just taken the side roads, and, he worked at the store in Dearborn Heights, a retail store, that he would go home probably took him about 10, 15 minutes to get home, but typically, he would work until the evening hours, then from that store, which I think was a little closer to Detroit, was, like, between where he was living and Detroit. I would say it probably took him 15, 20 minutes to cruise over to Michigan Ave in the city limits and hunt for females to pick up. So, it was a pretty close suburb to the city limits, really. There's Dearborn Heights, and then there's Dearborn, and Dearborn borders the city of Detroit, but Dearborn Heights is west of Dearborn, so it's a little bit further from the city, but, pretty close still, relatively speaking.
Okay. And as far as he's married at the time, or
Mhm.
does he have kids?
Mhm.
And
He
when did
has
that when was he married?
He was married, I believe it was 1998. And he and his wife were both in the Navy, both aboard the Nimitz, and they got married while they were in the Navy. And then they were discharged. And I am trying to think, it might have been spring 1999 that he actually was discharged. See, the Nimitz came to Virginia, to the port, and it docked for a while because it had to have some maintenance. And so they came on the Nimitz to um, Virginia, to the port there in 1998. And then because they were gonna be there for a while, a lot of people who were on the ship would get, an apartment in town. They wouldn't be staying on the ship, so, because they were gonna be there for an extended period, and so that's what Armstrong and his wife did, is they settled a little bit into Virginia, and then when they were both discharged from the Navy, they decided to move back to Michigan because that's where her family is originally from, and they're actually even still here, I believe. I tried to contact them and did not get a response. And living in the same house, believe it or not. But yeah, they moved and lived with Armstrong's in-laws, his wife's parents, in the Dearborn Heights in the neighborhood that I was talking about.
It's very interesting. So in December 1999, Monica Johnson, who's a 31-year-old mother of four, is found near a railroad track in Detroit. She dies the same day, and he later confesses to this murder, correct? Is that the first body that kind of appears?
Yep, yep, Monica was the first victim that we know of in Detroit, the first person who died. She was the second person he was known to have attacked. He did attack Natasha in August of that year. That was August 1999. And then he attacked Monica around the beginning of December 1999. And that was near the I-94 service drive at a little street, a very small street called Springwells. And so, yeah, that was the first murder that we can attribute to him. And of course, at that point, police would never have fathomed that they had a serial killer because they did occasionally get a deceased sex worker. It happens quite a bit.
So the police didn't have anything linking him at the time as far as witness descriptions or anything like that. It was just a person that they found deceased and they knew was
Mhm.
obviously murdered. Is
Yeah,
that
and it would have been possible if see, that was his second attack, like I said, and Natasha was actually attacked at a hotel that was on the border of Detroit and Dearborn, and it was Dearborn police who responded. So it was Dearborn police who, did a small investigation and did a report and all of that and took Natasha's statement, but Detroit would really have no way of knowing that, to be able to think, okay, maybe this is the guy that attacked this woman in August in Dearborn. No, there would have been no connection there. It wasn't until months later that there could be any connection made with the different murders that he was committing.
and Natasha, when she was picked up, they went back to the hotel and they didn't have sex and he leaves. Is that accurate?
Evidently, yeah, because he was nervous. She said he picked her up on Michigan Ave and they drove back to her motel room. And she lived on the west side of Michigan in Grand Rapids. And she would come to Detroit for a few days to make some money, and then she would go back to Grand Rapids. So, and she actually was not on drugs, which was unusual for, a lot of these women who are living a life at risk on the street or partaking in this risky behavior. A lot of them for them, it's the drugs that puts them out there to try to make money, but Natasha just wanted to get some money. And so she would rent this little motel room, and she actually would share it with other girls, as I understand too. One thing she told me. And so he picked her up, and she's like, "Okay, I got a motel room. Let's go back there." And he was very nervous. And see, that was the only time we know of the 10 incidents in Detroit that there ever was a motel room involved, and I think the motel did make him nervous, like, he figured there's just gonna be some people around, I can't control the situation, there could be somebody, hearing us in the next room, there could be somebody seeing me come in and out of the door, and so he was nervous about that, and she could tell he was nervous, and he came into the room, and he was a little shaky, and he's like, "Okay, I gotta use the bathroom." He went into the bathroom, and then he came out and said, "This doesn't feel right. I gotta leave." And so he took off out the door, but then a moment later, she gets a knock on the door and he's back. And she's like, "Okay, that's a little weird. He's back." But it quickly went sideways from there. She always regrets opening the door to him to let him back into the room because that's when he started to attack her.
And he attacked her with a knife?
He did. He carried a knife with him. The different police who worked on the case, who searched the Jeep that he drove, did report finding a couple different knives of varying sizes. And there were, again, out of the 5 survivors in Detroit, I know there were 3, Zelda, Natasha, and Cynthia, all reported him having a knife. And he did not use the knife to kill anyone. What he did is, and he evidently owned multiple knives, but he used a knife to subdue that female, to threaten her. Because I know one particular survivor, Zelda, described him as just holding the knife like, menacing over her. And so with Natasha, though, because he wielded that knife and she's realizing, okay, this is not good. This guy did not come back to my room to have sex. They got into a big tussle and they kind of rolled around the room and she got all cut up. She had to have stitches after that encounter. She got her hair all ripped. She had blood matted all over her head from being cut up. But it was because she was trying to wrestle away from him and he had that knife and it was doing some damage.
So in January 2000, Armstrong reports finding the body of Wendy Jordan. That's a really interesting story. Can you tell us about that?
Yep. That was New Year's when he picked up Wendy in Detroit. Wendy was another unusual situation for Armstrong in that he picked her up in his Jeep. He killed her in Detroit, but he carried her in his Jeep as he drove almost all the way home. I don't know what was going through his head. He usually, like with the rest of the females, even for instance, Cynthia, who survived, he tried to strangle her. She passed out. I think he might have thought she was gone, but he pushed her out of the Jeep. And that's what he did with the other females that he killed. He would kill them and he would push them out the passenger side door of the Jeep. For some reason, I have no idea why, with Wendy, he left her in the car and he started to drive home, and he from where he was on Warren Avenue in Detroit, he had to drive around where the Rouge River is in Dearborn Heights, and he was only a block or two from home. He was
Oh, wow.
almost home, of probably a 15-minute drive, when he pulled over in this bridge that goes over the river. He then took Wendy, and this is the middle of the night, so evidently he was never seen doing this. He got out of the Jeep and took Wendy and pushed her over the bridge into the Rouge River, which at the time, because this is the beginning of January, it was icy. It was like water and ice together. It wasn't totally frozen, but he pushed her out of that, and then he got back in his Jeep and he drove home, and he did his usual routine. Often, when he came back from these encounters, he would take a shower and crawl into bed with his wife, and sleep till morning. That was his mo. But then the next day he had to work, and that was January 2nd. So he got up to work at the store, and he would go in like probably mid morning, and he had a shift that went until, I want to say, like 5 or 6 at night that particular day. He had varying hours at the store. But he asked his supervisor if he could go home early. He said he wasn't really feeling that well, and he blamed it on whatever he had for lunch, etc. And so he started heading home at about 4 o'clock. Um, and he was coming home from the store, his regular route, which goes right by that bridge where he had left Wendy just hours earlier. And he pulled over the Jeep at the bridge, and he got out and walked over to the bridge and looked over. Now, there's been some speculation of the cops that worked the case on why he did that. I think the general consensus, or maybe the prevailing theory, is that he wanted to see if she was still there, or if she had moved, maybe floated somewhere else, if she was still visible. And there she was. She was right there where he left her. And like I said, it was only hours earlier. And I don't know if he panicked about that. He didn't tend to hide his victims. He tended to leave them out in the open anyways. So this is another strange aspect of this case, is why did he do what he does next? Because he did notice that across the street from where he was and down a couple doors, there was a home there where there were a couple of people standing outside. This was a young man and his girlfriend, and they were about ready to hop in the car because he was going to give her a lift home. And so they were outside the house though, and they were the only ones around evidently. And so he noticed them and he figured, well, they've noticed me too. And so they got in their car and they pulled out of the driveway and they went in the direction of where Armstrong had parked his Jeep. And he ran out and flagged them down and said, "Hey, there's a body in the river. You got to call the police." Now, either he didn't have a cell phone himself, or he was just trying to pretend he didn't have a cell phone. It seems like from the files, that he didn't actually have a cell phone, but he was asking them to call 911 and report this body that he had found, in quotes, in the river. And so then it went from there. Dearborn Heights police responded to this. They came, they did a whole crime scene investigation. They questioned everyone at the scene, including Armstrong. And that's when he first really came on police radar, because his story did not seem to make sense. They became suspicious of him, and the suspicion only grew after that night at the bridge.
Did they have any other theories about why he called or why he stopped? Was this a
He
sexual
claimed
experience for him, or
Well, he claimed that, that's another aspect too, because there is a necrophilia
right?
element of this case. So that is an interesting aspect, that, okay, did he stop because maybe he was going to go visit the body? But then he realized, okay, these people across the street are like looking at me at times. They notice I pulled over. I got to have a plausible excuse for why I pulled over, which he did claim that he was driving home from work and feeling sick because he seemed to have set that up during the workday with the supervisor. I'm not feeling well. So he claimed to police that he stopped right there at the bridge to vomit over the bridge. Well, as one Dearborn Heights police officer told me, he said, okay, if you're driving home and you're almost home, wouldn't you just go home to vomit? And if you're pulling over anyways, a block or two from home, thinking you're going to throw up, and you look over the bridge and you see someone dead there on the ice and water, wouldn't that absolutely make you throw up? And he never vomited. So the lack of vomit was suspicious for the police, but that's what he claimed. That was the official story. But yeah, you do have to wonder if he was just, if he was checking to see if she was still there, or if, yeah, like maybe he was, had a necrophilia type plan there. I have no idea. It is quite the mystery.
Yeah, I found that really odd, and I was thinking about plausible excuses or reasons for why he would actually stop that, because it seems to be just really putting yourself out there. I mean, he's allegedly done murders before and other crimes and been pretty cautious about it and not been caught, and it sounds like this is really the first time that police are looking at him as a suspect. Is that accurate?
Yep, after that point, Dearborn Heights had him pegged. They really felt he had something to do with this. They felt like the whole story just didn't make sense. And the more he talked to them, the more they were just very uneasy with him. They did a full interview with him, I guess I would say, as a witness at the scene, but they kept him a very long time and asked him all kinds of stuff just because of how suspicious they were. And then after that point, they followed him around. They investigated him with his employers and with people who knew the neighbors, and they stole the trash off the curb, and they investigated him pretty strongly. Um, and then they got warrants for his DNA, and it just progressed from there. And they basically had him pegged.
And when they're taking DNA, it's a blood sample, is that
It's
right?
different samples. They did take the typical blood and bodily fluids, but they wanted hair samples from him because they
Okay.
also searched the Jeep that night. They asked for his permission, "Can we look in your Jeep?" And he gave permission. He had no issue with that. But they also asked for hair samples because they knew they were gonna most likely find something on the woman in the river who was eventually, well, actually the next day, identified as Wendy Jordan. And indeed, they did find DNA in Wendy that linked up to Armstrong ultimately. But you figure, okay, you got to have his hair samples, you got to have a variety of samples. And that was another strange aspect of this case, is that when he showed up to give his hair sample at the hospital, the nurse reported later that he had made an attempt to fully shave. So that the
Not
process
guilty at
would
all.
be
Yeah.
thwarted. But I guess it was a skilled nurse. He said he was still able to get a sample from Armstrong. So just another weird aspect of this case.
So things progress pretty quickly after January. It seems like April, things really take off?
Yeah, April is when everything um everything came to a head, in that he he cooled it after Wendy Jordan on January 1st. He cooled it for at least probably 2.5 months. It was mid-March before he attacked someone again, and that was Roosevelt. And then he escalated. It's almost like, okay, he got away with the Roosevelt murder, and he just like was boom, 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 because he attacked several more people and some of them survived. He killed two more people, but he attacked three more people. So five more people after that point, and really six more people altogether after Wendy, if I've counted correctly. So yeah, he had this period between mid-March and April 10th where he escalated quite a bit, and then he was ultimately arrested on April 10th.
Yeah, so I thought that was kind of a unique time because he seems to just go on like a tantrum where he's going after one prostitute to the next, and he's not successful, but it seems like he's just not. Do you think he's just like not worried about it, or is this at a point where he just can't control his own actions and he's just continuing to do this?
Yep, I think he was definitely not able to control his own actions. I also think there's a lot of gray area there because he would sometimes leave people alive where maybe he thought they were dead or truly meant to kill them. But I also think he sometimes left people alive and knew that he left them alive. Monica Johnson was left alive, and she died on the way to the hospital in the ambulance a couple hours later. Kelly Hood was left alive at the railroad tracks in the first week of April, and she died later. And then Cynthia, as I mentioned, was alive, passed out, and then woke up hours later on another street that she didn't recognize because he had dumped her there. Did he think that she was dead or did he realize that she was alive? I don't know. I almost feel like in looking at all the different attacks that he committed, and some died and some didn't, that he wasn't even sure what he wanted to do. I really have to wonder if
Right.
he he wasn't necessarily wanting to kill some of the time, but he flew out of control or whatever. When he was evaluated by a psychiatrist, I guess for the defense in his lead up to trial, he was diagnosed with something called intermittent explosive disorder. And I guess that was the defense attorney's attempt to establish that he was not in control of his actions or whatever. It did not go anywhere. I think it went right over right over the jury's head, like, who cares about that? Um, but it seemed to indicate that he would fly into a rage, and he actually claimed he blacked out sometimes too. So it's like, and then another thing he claimed is that he saw the face of his father, his biological father, who left the family, on at least one or two of these victims as he was strangling them. So there's that aspect in there too. But he did claim to black out sometimes. So almost out of control, leaving his consciousness in whatever way. But I don't know. I mean, if my collaborator Jerry Cliff were here, representing the Violent Crime Task Force, he takes a hard line on all of this, and he says, no, he meant to murder. He intended to murder every time. He's a cold-blooded killer, and that's the end of the story. So
Yeah, it just
I don't
seems so
know.
sloppy. Even him choosing, I saw
Yes.
where he chose Devon Marcus, where
Mm-hmm.
he paid him $40 for sex and
Mm-hmm.
attempted to strangle him, and then Marcus escapes
Mm-hmm.
and reports to police and was able to ID Armstrong. That
Yes.
just seems like a really bad idea. I mean, if the whole point is to find these really vulnerable, small, frail women that you can strangle to death,
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that, he probably wasn't as frail or a very good victim. So that's why I didn't know if he's just like, I'm going to see the first prostitute that I see and they're going to be my victim. It just doesn't seem very selective at all.
He was not picky at all. He did not go after any particular type at all. And maybe it was a matter of who was convenient on the street, who looked, like they were they were an easy target. I don't know, but yes, you are correct in that he really was not discriminating in victim choice. And like the time he picked up Devin, and then also Wilhelmina Train, those 2 times, the person was in the Jeep, and he made a move on them, and they fought him off and got out of the Jeep, and really, the encounter did not even injure the other person, the victim. They were fine. They got away without an injury or maybe even a bruise. So, Yeah, definitely not very good at it at times, and you do wonder what was really going through Armstrong's head, but I guess maybe he figured, "Okay, I'm in Detroit, I'm on Michigan Ave, this is where the sex work is really thriving. I mean, if I attack somebody and they get away, it's like, who cares? They're not even going to tell police. And police, even if they tell police, they're never going to investigate it. There's like, okay, that happens 45 times a night. So big deal. It's Detroit. So maybe that's what was going through his head is that he really didn't care that a few people got away. And, but, those two people in particular they both gave good descriptions to police that were very helpful in getting him arrested, very instrumental in getting him arrested.
So you've got Dearborn, which I'm assuming is keeping an eye on him. And Detroit, they've got this violent crime task force. And then April 10th, I believe, is the day that the violent crimes task force is actually having a meeting, and one of their investigators gets a call about three bodies being discovered on the railroad tracks. Can you walk us through that day?
Yeah, that was April 10th, and actually it was April 12th that he was arrested like a day and a half later. So, um, a correction to what I said earlier. But yeah, April 10th was the day of the discovery at the railroad tracks. And Jerry has a really good story about this. Is sitting in this meeting with the Violent Crime Task Force or with his colleagues. Because really, I think the Violent Crime Task Force existed before that point, but the discovery that day mobilized that task force for this particular crime. But, he was sitting with colleagues in a meeting and somebody's pager went off and, "Okay, excuse me, I gotta go answer this." And that person then came back to the meeting and said, "Well, there's been a body discovered at the railroad tracks at Military and John Kronk. So that's a little weird." So they continued on with the meeting, and then pretty soon the pager goes off again, and he excuses himself, "Okay, they found another body." So eventually, site at Military and John Kronk, the railroad tracks there, the Conrail came through there hauling freight. They discovered three women and they realized that they were in varying states of decomposition. So they had been left there at different times. And that was the feeling of dread on the part of police is that, oh my gosh, we've got a serial killer. This is all the same person at different times. And, they really want to release that news to the public, I think, at first, because, of course, the notion of a serial killer being in town does strike a certain panic. But yeah, that was the day that everything blew open for this case. And then finally, like within the next 24 hours, or within the next 48 hours, at the time of the arrest, at least by that time, then Dearborn Heights and Detroit finally realized they were actually working on the same case. Detroit only had the case for about a day and a half till Armstrong was arrested, but Dearborn Heights had been investigating this guy since January 2nd. So they had like what 3 or 4 months into it at that point, and then both municipalities, both police agencies came together and were able to compare notes and build their case.
So I thought it was really interesting that they've got these three bodies. Were the bodies posed at all?
Yeah, the police felt like they were posed. A couple, and Rose were more in the brush. Rose was left there first in mid-March. So she was more in the brush, though, like I said, Armstrong did not take too much care to hide these women. Definitely not with Monica Johnson because she was right out there on the sidewalk when somebody who was driving by spotted her and called the police, and then she was taken by ambulance to the hospital and, like I said, died by the time they arrived at the hospital. But at the railroad tracks, Rose was kind of in the brush, not well hidden, but, enough so where the train going by never spotted her, up until the police coming there that day to find her. And then Kay was the second person left there, and she was semi hidden in the brush too, because you have the railroad tracks and then you have a service drive next to it, and then you have like a little bit of a tree line, and then there's like a neighborhood or something beyond that, but you had brush and trees, a natural border there next to the service drive. And so Nicole was Armstrong's final known victim, and she is the one that the person on the Conrail train actually spotted that morning of April 10th. And it was like 9 o'clock in the morning, something like that, that the train was coming through. It was probably just getting light out or hadn't been light very long. And they realized, oh my gosh, there's a person there. And then realized, okay, that's a body. And so then they called the Conrail police, which is their protocol. They arrived and then they called Detroit police in. And so hence the pagers going off in the meeting. um, but as far as being posed, Nicole was the one that I think they really felt was being posed, because she was next to the railroad tracks, right out in the open, and she did have her legs spread, unfortunately, very in a very vulgar fashion. Now, talking about Kelly and Rose, there was a certain degree of how they were positioned, where they were found, that seemed to give police the idea that they were posed in some fashion, but also with the necrophilia aspect. It's just possible that he had returned there and had sex with them after they were dead, and that was how he had left them too. But police did feel, definitely with Nicole and maybe with some of the others, that he was posing them, and definitely with the progression there at the railroad tracks and the fact that he didn't even bother to put Nicole anywhere else but just right there where he had driven off in his away from in his Jeep, and left her there. Didn't move her anywhere else, just left her there right by the tracks, right out in the open. The police really had the vibe of cat and mouse when they saw her there. So yeah, he seemed to be playing at that point.
And so the uh, task force unit, don't they call the FBI's behavioral unit that day for assistance?
They did. The lead of the violent, or the creator of the Violent Crime Task Force, Doc is what they called him. Very well respected leader in Detroit police with many years serving on the force. He had a friend who worked in the FBI who did some profiling, and so he did consult that friend, and just to get his take on all of this. And the very worthwhile nugget that the FBI agent gave him was that, okay, you're concentrating on his successes there at the railroad tracks, these three women he killed, but you maybe need to turn your attention to his failures, because there's probably people out there that he didn't kill who can ID him. And indeed, that was absolutely true. And their proof of that was coming right away in the people who reported like the two survivors in particular who reported their accounts to police with a good description of Armstrong.
I do think that's an interesting aspect to look at things because when you're looking at serial killers and the amount of really just work that is involved in investigating one homicide, but when you're investigating multiples, and then you've got three all in one day, I mean, I know what it's like to be there for a homicide with multiple victims, and it's very chaotic, and there's a lot of people that have to get involved to be able to do it properly. So I do think that that's a very good point to remember. So they are able to finally, do they get I assume they get a warrant for his arrest and then they start looking for him, and that's where they found him on April 12th?
Yep. There were a couple. Okay, I'll back up a second. The Violent Crime Task Force was an interagency task force led by Detroit police, but involving various agencies. So you had an officer from this agency and from that agency. So it was a way to come together and share expertise to investigate a case like this. And so they put the full force of this Violent Crime Task Force on the case. And then they also spread the news, of course, through the whole Detroit Police Department. And there were a couple patrol officers who I guess you would say they thought it would be kinda cool or almost funny if they were to go look for this guy, because 'cause they're just patrol officers, they're relatively new in their job, and they're not this task force, which you have to have some really good experience to be part of this task force. They're patrol cops, patrol officers. So, it was almost like there was a little bit of that going on in that it was like an us and them type of thing, and so they knew their area that they patrolled, and they went out that night, and they figured they was gonna talk to the prostitutes. They were gonna talk to the sex workers that they found. They were gonna see if anybody saw anything, anybody suspects anything, and of course, a lot of these females had turned up missing, and other females working the streets knew that they were missing for a few weeks, and so they just wanted to see what they could find out, and they did find the one survivor, Devon, and convinced Devin to with a little bit of cash, convinced Devin to tell the story of being attacked by this guy, this big, burly, reddish-haired guy with wireframe glasses driving a dark Jeep, and Devin described, like, the spare tire on the back having a cover that said Jeep on it, and gave a pretty good description of the whole thing. And I don't know if it was Devin that mentioned the baby doll plate on the front too. There was like a decorative plate on the front of the Jeep that said baby doll. So that's where we get the baby doll, because that was a nickname that Armstrong and his wife shared. And so Devin gave this description of this guy. And with that, the two patrol officers then started looking for a guy in a Jeep fitting this description. And so they were the ones that I think the following night, would have been the 12th, that they actually spotted somebody. I mean, Armstrong was right back out there. I have no idea to this day if he watched the news about the railroad track discovery, if he realized that three of his victims had turned up and police were all over this. I don't know if he knew that, but he was right back Michigan Ave hunting again, and they spotted him. And they pulled him over and they started asking him questions. And then by that time, these two patrol officers are questioning Armstrong on the curb on Michigan Ave. Then, pretty soon, the crime task force, which had been in an unmarked van nearby, had spotted this whole thing happening, like, had spotted the Jeep, which they also had the description of the guy, because in the meantime, in the meantime, Wilhelmina Drain had reported her own attack and the fact that the guy was driving a Jeep and all of that. So the police had all this information on all the corners of the staff or the precincts. And so the Violent Crime Task Force realized a couple of their patrol officers had pulled over somebody in a Jeep matching the description that they had. And so then soon, a few minutes later, they swarm, and then, they take Armstrong into custody, and it all happens. It all goes down, and he's taken downtown.
Yeah, I'm sure, that was a eventful time, especially for the beat cops that were working. So, they initially charge him with just Wendy Jordan's murder, is that correct?
Mhm. Well, okay, Wendy Jordan's case, finally at this point, like I had said, Dearborn Heights and Detroit realize, oh gosh, we're working on the same case. Dearborn Heights is like, you got our guy in custody that we've been investigating for the past few months. And so they had already been compiling information. They had already done the DNA testing, all the investigation of the Wendy Jordan murder. And so they had been waiting. They could not actually arrest Armstrong until they had the final results of the DNA testing in hand. And back then, in the year 2000, it took a lot longer to get DNA results. And so their hands were tied for several weeks waiting for these results. They really wanted to arrest Armstrong, but they had to have the strongest case they did. And so then they learned that Detroit arrested Armstrong. And so, then they're all sharing notes and they're all working on the same case. And they did decide that Wendy Jordan's case was the strongest case. That one out in front. That was the first trial for Armstrong. And then the Kelly Hood case was placed next because I think they had some good DNA evidence with Kelly too. So that was going to be trial number two, and it was trial number two. And then the others would have followed beyond that. But Armstrong did plead out at that point after the two convictions for Wendy and for Kelly. He was convicted twice with mandatory life sentences. So he just pled out on the rest of the charges.
One story I heard in that initial interview was the way that the detective explained to Armstrong DNA and how to get DNA off someone.
Mhm.
Could you share that?
The idea of touch DNA, yeah,
Yes.
basically, which has kinda gone back and forth a little bit over the years, but back then in 2000, not quite as much was known about DNA. And so these 2 police officers, one was more a veteran and one was more a rookie, were sent into the room to question Armstrong after his arrest, to do the initial questioning, interrogation. And so the young guy, the rookie, is engaging him in all kinds of small talk and developing a rapport with him. In fact, they did develop a rapport, and Armstrong, did speak freely to him about a lot of different things. And so he felt very comfortable with this young cop. Well, the veteran cop is watching all of this, watching the conversation for an hour or two, watching the discussion of breakfast cereal and sports teams and whatever, whatever came to mind. And hey, this is going great. These guys are getting along great, but we got to get to the heart of the matter here. And so James Hines was his name. He leaned forward and he touched Armstrong's hand and he said, "Do you know what I just did, Eric? Do you know what just happened?" And Eric's like, "Ugh, not quite sure what to say." And Officer Hines explained to him, he said, "There's a piece of you on me and a piece of me on you. That's how DNA works. Do you realize we're investigating all of this? We're running tests on those women. Are we going to find their DNA, your DNA in them? We're going to be able to connect them to you through this DNA." Something to that effect. I'm badly paraphrasing it, but he really shook him down. DNA thing, that idea that he was cornered. That was the point. You are cornered. We have you cornered. Now, of course, they didn't quite have him cornered yet. They were about to have him cornered. They did have a good case involving DNA, but he was throwing it out there and it was enough to break Armstrong. And so finally he's like, "Okay, I did it. I did it. I did it." And then we're like, "Okay, let's start this process. Let's get out our pens and confession sheets and let's start logging it for the records." So the confessions flowed forth freely after that point.
And did he confess to only 5 that day?
He confessed to He started confessing to the Detroit crimes. He did not There was only one survivor that he confessed to, in Cynthia. He never even confessed to attacking Natasha the August before. He didn't confess to any of the others that he attacked, but he did make a confession on Cynthia. He really honestly thought that she had died. But, the 5 women in Detroit that he killed, and then as he got talking, he started talking about his Navy years, and as part of that whole confession spree, which went over several hours with Detroit police, he did make confessions to 10 additional murders while he was serving in the Navy in the 1990s. So, yes, he was confessing to everything during that same time period.
So I found that was really interesting too. Do you think he's confessing to those overseas murders because he actually did them, or do you think he's just trying to make himself feel important when he's obviously very vulnerable in an interrogation room and it's clearly lost power and control?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That is a question that a lot of people wonder. He's pretty detailed in those confessions. He never remembers the girl's name. I think there was one person out of the 10 Navy confessions that he gave some kinda name that he remembered that she gave. I think one. He never remembers any kinda name or anything, and maybe, maybe that's naivety on my part, maybe they just don't exchange names in that kinda situation, I don't know.
Right.
But, he remembered what she was wearing, he remembered how old she was, he remembered what color hair. He gave descriptions for a lot of details. He remembered, where he picked her up, where they went, where he left her. He really gave a lot of details. And so and the way that it would come out of him, it'd be like, I mean, he'd be in the midst of telling about one encounter and he'd be like, I think I remember another one, but let me think about it a little bit more. So I don't know. It was almost like the way that he phrased it, he was trying to remember more. He was trying like he was being accommodating and trying to give this to police, and he did seem very penitent. Now again, Jerry, if he were here, would be saying no, he was all playing for the cameras, so to speak. There weren't any cameras on him, but he's all playing, he's just putting on an act. He's not the least bit repentant about any of this. He doesn't care, he's just trying to manipulate. But he was crying a lot during these confessions, and he would often note in the confessions at the end of them, because the police would give him his Miranda rights for each and every confession, just to dot all their I's and cross all their
Right.
T's. And then at the like they would show him what they down and make him look at every page and make him initial every page and then make him sign the end. And when he signed the end of some of these confessions, he would write like a little hand note, like, I'm really sorry for what I did. I hope the families can forgive me. Stuff to that effect. He would write a few lines on some of them in his own handwriting about feeling sorry for all of this. So I don't know. I mean, I really feel like you could make an argument either way that he truly was repentant in that moment. Although the story changed by the time he went to trial, he was denying everything. Like, just throw those confessions out the window because I didn't do anything. Yeah. So there's that. But in the moment, those hours, and they did provide him with food and breaks. So it wasn't a matter of being tired or hungry or whatever. But in that moment, you have to wonder, was he so weak and crying? Was it genuine, or was he truly just putting on an act? It's a very good question.
Yeah, and I really doubt his sincerity. I really think that this is more of he is crying for himself. But so the State Department and NCIS contacts these countries, and we hit on this before, and the countries are just not cooperative and don't really care. Is that correct?
Yeah, and they did they gave at best a very lackadaisical investigation. Like, NCIS would contact somebody in Taiwan or Singapore or Hong Kong or whatever. Um, and they'd be like, "Okay," they give them the details, the time frame, because the NCIS, of course, had the whole schedule of the Nimitz for all of those years, and they had the schedule of when Armstrong was on leave and when he was not, and so they could pinpoint exactly where he was, and time frames was something he was not very clear on. He approximated time frames when he was talking about some of these crimes, but they don't always match when the Nimitz was in port at that area. So I will say his timeframes are messed up. But so the NCIS would contact this municipality and say, okay, we're talking about this time frame. We're even maybe even give them some details of the confession, like the female was about this old and ethnicity or whatever. And they'd be like, okay, we'll look into that. And it really I think they just didn't wanna bother, and like you said, they probably just didn't care all that much about the investigations, so they did not come back with anything at all for any of these. The only confession that he made to a Navy era murder was Virginia right before he moved back to Michigan, 1998. The Virginia confession was actually paired with a murder. Now, see, there's that too. That would tend to make somebody think, okay, maybe all 10 are true if the one was true. Because we can pin that Virginia confession to a murder based on the details. It matches really well. So you have to think, okay, maybe he did do the rest. But yeah, these different places, these different police agencies that were contacted really did, I don't think, put forth much of an effort to try to solve any of these cases or to prove whether or not these confessions were true.
So you mentioned this earlier as well that he goes to court for the second time, and this is when he has a change of heart with the confessions. Can you tell us about what happened in court or how that
Well,
went?
well, for the Kelly Hood trial, he was still trying to maintain his innocence. Now, for the first trial, he had a different lawyer. And after the conviction for Wendy Jordan's murder, he fired his lawyer and got a different lawyer. So he did take a little bit different approach for the second trial. I think for the first trial, the approach that that attorney took for the Wendy Jordan murder was that, well, he kind of wavered between different approaches because it was wondered if maybe he would try an insanity thing. You know, when you've got DNA evidence and you've got confessions, where else can you go? There's not many places you can go with that. But he didn't truly go with the insanity defense, although he did have the psychiatric diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder. But, one tactic that the first attorney did do in court was to claim that, yeah, Armstrong had met up with Wendy. He picked her up. They had consensual sex, but she was perfectly fine when he left. He did not kill her. And that did not work. With the Kelly trial, it wasn't quite that descriptive. The Kelly's trial did not last as long as I recall, and I don't know that that attorney's approach was really much different other than just try to get him off the charges and try to somehow prove that he didn't do it. But again, he had a lot of stuff going against him at that trial as well.
Okay, so ultimately he's found guilty and he's sentenced. So I was really impressed when I was looking back at this and how much research you did. And one of the things I think is really interesting is the fact that you interviewed him in person. Can you tell
Sorta.
us about what that process is like? Because for my book, I attempted to interview a guy on death row, and his name is Terry Hyatt. He never returned my emails. I tried to keep it really light, like, hey, what sports do you like? You know, what's your favorite color? Blah, blah, blah.
Mhm, mhm.
And just sitting down and hitting the send button was
Mhm.
very awkward, and I later told my wife, and she was her first question was, "Is he ever gonna get out?" So,
Mm.
can you take us through that process of actually getting in contact with him
Mhm.
and what that was like?
Yep, yep, I sent him an initial email. I did not beat around the bush. I said, "Hey, I'm a writer. I wanna do a book about your case. I'd like to talk to you." And I said it in a friendly way, but I laid it all out there, like, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you." He didn't answer at first. I sent another email a few weeks later, I think, and to nudge him a little more, like, "Hey, it's totally your choice. You don't have to talk to me, but I would love it if you would." So, maybe there was just something about how I phrased it, I don't know. But he eventually did write back, probably just to get rid of me, but he said, "Thanks, I appreciate it, but I really don't wanna get involved in a book right now." He said it like, "I don't wanna do a book right now." I think if I remember right, which was a
Like
little
he's busy or
interesting.
something, yeah.
Yeah, interesting way to put it. Um, he said something like, "I don't think it would be right to put my family or the victims' families through this again." So that was an interesting thing to say as well. And so I'm like, okay. I replied saying, okay, I understand. Thank you. I appreciate the reply. Of course, I can still do the book. I would rather be able to talk to you, but I essentially told him in a nice way, I'm going to do the book whether you talk to me or not, because it was almost like I got the tone from his email like he was going to try to prevent me from doing a book on the case. But um, he did say that he would talk to me, but he doesn't want to talk about the case. And so that's what really started the dialogue. And then I said, well, I'd like to come see you in prison, just sit down with you. It's perfectly fine if you don't talk about the case, just let me come visit. Because I really found value in the idea of seeing him in person, seeing his mannerisms, seeing how he carries himself, just kind of getting a feel for who he is as a person nowadays. That was really, I was perfectly fine hopping in the car, driving 2 hours to the prison to do that because I saw a lot of value in that. So I did visit him twice in prison, sat down with him for, gosh, we talked for between 1 and 2 hours both times. And that was quite a trip. That was the first time I ever visited somebody in prison. And of course, you've got to lay out the groundwork ahead of time. He's got to add me to his visitors list. So there's a
Right.
certain amount of permission that has to happen. And even with that, then I've got to fill out a form and submit that. And then it has to be processed at the prison, at the Michigan Department of Corrections. And they got to okay everything. And then once all that happened, I was able to set aside a time and day. And really, I could come by anytime, but I did set up a time with him to come visit at first. And then, oh gosh, the most disturbing thing about the whole situation is that there was no way I could take any notes or record or capture anything. As a journalist, that's what drove me crazy. You see the TV documentaries where somebody's being interviewed in prisons, and I guess it takes a lot of approvals and a lot of process to make
Yeah.
that happen, to set up a TV interview or any kind of interview, because man, you go to visit somebody and they take everything off you but a few articles of clothing. It's like you can have all my jewelry. I got to take off all my earrings and my rings and everything. I think my shoes and I'm like, okay, I can't take a pen and a pad of paper, or definitely not a phone, never a phone. So being stripped of everything, so to speak, before going in there was really disheartening, because I just wanted to capture what we talked about even. I just wanted to make note of that. Even if he wasn't talking about the case, I still wanted to capture it in some way. And so I would talk with them, and very pleasant conversations, both sides, both times, very nice conversations, a really nice guy to talk to. I will say again, I've said it several times. I know it's insane, but really nice person to talk with. And then I was on my phone on the way home on the highway. I hit the highway and I was using my voice app to just speak everything I could remember us talking about and him saying. And then when I got home, I transcribed that into notes, that I mean, I told him I wouldn't quote him, and I still have never quoted him in the stuff that he told me. Um, but there were things that he talked about that I just wanted to capture for myself because I found them interesting from a psychological perspective. So I tried to write down as much as I could remember. And then I alluded to it a little bit in the book, the types of things that we talked about without getting into too much detail. But yeah, talk about a trip, and kind of getting at something that you said earlier, um, what it was like to do that. I continued emailing him back and forth. We had an email friendship for a little while there, and I would get an email from him talking about this or that, small talk, whatever, what's happening today or what's happening tomorrow or whatever there at the prison. And then a moment later, I'd be talking to Natasha on the phone. And every time I talk to Natasha, she goes, well, almost every time, a lot of the times, especially early on that I talked to Natasha, she went through the whole thing again. It's like she was really processing a lot when I was talking with her for the book. She was doing just a lot of processing about what had happened, because she does have a lot of stress, post traumatic stress over it. So she'd go through all the details of the attacking, and I'm like, "Man, how can this be the person I was just chatting with through email that was so pleasant and pleasant to sit down with in that meeting room at the prison?" I don't know, it's very surreal and almost, not able to be reconciled.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting of how this is kind of like his Opie side that you're seeing, and, there's that dark side that just snaps and,
Mhm.
yeah, has no self-control.
Mhm. Yeah, it's crazy. It is truly the million-dollar question of why this human being and any human being that takes life, human life, um, how does that happen? What what happens in a person to cause them to cross that line? And it's truly a mystery with Armstrong.
So you are doing a series on Michigan serial killers, right?
I
This
seem to be.
is well, you've got the Crack City Strangler as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there a 3rd that's gonna be coming out,
I have an
or
idea for a 3rd book. Either myself or, someone I know could actually write it. I'm sure another author could write another book in the series for Wild Blue Press. I'm sure they would be happy with that. But there is an there's other serial killer cases in Detroit. There's been some recent ones. D'Angelo Martin comes to mind. Um, so serial killers do sometimes still happen, although I think they truly had their heyday back in the 80s and 90s, like when this case was happening, late 90s, early 2000s. But yeah, there's another case that has been fascinating me, but only if my former colleague is not going to investigate it because he's the one who mentioned it to me and said it would make a good book project and he would like to do it, but I don't know if he plans to do it. So maybe if he does not, I would like to tackle that one. It is an unsolved case.
we'll be waiting for that one. Well, again, I really am impressed with the book and the amount of research and time you've spent with this, as well as your colleague working on it. The book is The Baby Doll Serial Killer by B.R. Bates, and you can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, I'm sure. Is this all the Wild Blue typical places? Books a Million? Is
Yeah.
it on Audible?
Yes, there is an audiobook of this one. So, yes, by a very talented narrator. So, check that out too.
Great. Well, B.R. Bates, thank you very much. And you are actually going to be coming on the show in another week to talk about
The
your other
Crack City Strike.
Crack City Strangler, which another side note here, those covers are amazing. And that's kind of what
Are
drew me
they?
to the case. Yeah.
Yes, and I
And
had absolutely nothing to do with that other than supplying photos for the book, but yeah, those covers are dynamite, very eye-catching.
well, if you want to learn more about Armstrong and his criminal life, please buy her book. And thank you for joining us. Good night.
Thank you so much.
And we're finally done.